when we're looking at what kind of radiation exposure is the population exposed to as a whole, we see that the dose which people receive comes from several sources. This is the per caput dose or the per capita dose, that is per person. So medical radiation, weapons fallout, cosmic radiation, terrestrial gamma radiation, internal radiation, and radon and thoron. So I think there's no need for me to go through these terms because they're quite simple, but this just gives you a little idea of what are the main sources of radiation that the population is exposed to naturally. So this baseline dose will also be taken into account when you're setting your dose limits in place, your diagnostic reference levels, etc. So these are just figures which were taken from the 2010 review of exposure. And what we see generally is that the total dose from radiation in the environment is around 2.3 millisievert. So keep this number in your mind. 2.3 millisievert is the dose that you will just be exposed to naturally as a result of living in this world with all the different types of ionizing radiation around you. So this is a good reference number for when we're calculating what doses can we then expose people to as a result of medical treatments. And in total, once you consider patient exposure from medical radiation and occupational exposure, the total dose averaged over the population of the UK is 2.7 millisievert. Okay. So we talked about the dose which people are exposed to, but what is actually the mechanism which is causing the biological damage to happen? So when the human body is irradiated, we know that the radiation causes ionization to happen, which is the source of the damage. So in this case, there's two types of changes which can occur in the body. One is chemical changes may be taking place, which are an immediate effect. There may also be carcinogenic changes to the cells and also chromosomal changes. And the timeline in which these effects will appear over in the human body is different. So we're looking at different periods of risk depending on when the effect will actually show up. And we also know that the more rapidly a cell divides, the greater is its sensitivity to this kind of damage. So just to go a little further into what is the cause of the damage, there's two types of damage, as I said, direct and the main molecules to which this kind of damage will be happening is proteins and enzymes. They're the ones which are most susceptible to being damaged by ionizing radiation. Now, direct damage happens when the ionization causes the chemical bonds in the molecules to denature, which damages them and changes their function. Indirect damage happens when free radicals are produced, which can then create chain reactions in the tissue. So the main free radical which is produced is a hydroxyl ion. The hydroxyl ion is produced when water is ionized and then it decomposes. So that OH minus that you see in that formula over there is the one that we're really worried about, and this is the free radical which produces a series of damaging chain reactions in tissue. And this is a graphic that I've taken from FARS, and it's just explaining what are the different levels in which the damage happens. So there are damages to the individual molecules, there are damages to the subcellular structures such as membranes, and there's also damages which take place at the cellular level. And the two types of cellular damage which take place give rise to two types of effects. So they give rise to deterministic effects and stochastic effects. And this distinction is going to be very important because of the way in which the damage happens and the way in which the effects appear. And this knowledge is what is going to be the root of the legislation that they are going to impose on exposure to ionizing radiation. So let's quickly look at what are these two types of effects, deterministic effects and stochastic effects. So what we know about deterministic effects is that they have what is known as a threshold. So if the dose is below the threshold, the effect does not appear. As the dose increases over the threshold, the effect is more likely to appear until finally it reaches a point where the if the dose crosses certain threshold, then the person will definitely show the effect. So as you can see here, the curves, there's something called a dose incidence curve, which is measuring the incidence of the effect versus the dose that the patient is exposed to. And what you'll see is that if it's a less severe effect and the damage is more reversible, the threshold will be lower. Whereas if it's a more severe effect, the threshold of dose that the patient needs to be exposed to will be higher. Another thing that we need to remember when it comes to deterministic effects is that the damage can be cumulative. So damage over the course of your lifetime can add to the appearance or manifestation of deterministic effects. Another thing is that deterministic, in the type of damage which causes these effects, which are listed in the table on the left, there's also a probability of the cells repairing themselves. So the rate at which the patient is exposed to the radiation also has an effect on how the effect is going to appear. And this is an important table on the left-hand side. It's just letting you know what are the types of deterministic effects that can occur and what is the threshold dose above which they will appear. And please notice that the threshold dose is given in gray and it says absorbed dose. And the reason for this is simply, as I told you, that absorbed dose and equivalent dose are similar, the same for X-ray and gamma radiation. So that's the important points about deterministic effects. And now we discuss the other type of effect, which is stochastic effects. Now, a few things that the few pertinent differences between the two effects are first the linear no threshold theory. So stochastic effects don't have a threshold above which they will appear. Rather, the risk of the effect appearing just increases linearly as the exposure increases. So I'll just repeat that again. There's no threshold above which a stochastic effect is certain to appear. It's just that the risk of a stochastic effect manifesting increases linearly with the exposure to the radiation. So that's what's given here. Risk increases with dose. And unlike with deterministic effects, the severity of the effect is independent of the dose. Another important point about stochastic effects is that there may be something called a latency period, which is the period of time in between the exposure and the manifestation. So this is important to calculate when you're looking at risk, because if you're looking at a 70-year-old and if the effect that you're talking about has a latency period of 20 years, then the 70-year-old is it's quite likely that they will die before the effect appears. Whereas if a 20-year-old is exposed to the same radiation, then it's much more likely that they will experience the consequences of this effect just because of the contrast between their life expectancy and the latency period. Genetic effects also come under stochastic effects. So the appearance of genetic effects because of ionizing radiation is not very certainly studied. There's not any clear numbers on what might be the prevalence rate, but in order to offset the risk, there's a certain threshold dose. There's a certain calculation they make of what is the risk of genetic effects appearing in the population per millisievert that the population is exposed to, and you can read all those figures and be aware of what those figures are. The other thing is the risk of childhood cancer, which comes from exposure of the gonads of the parents or the reproductive organs of the parents. And again, there's a certain risk factor which is taken into account there. Just when you're making laws about people of reproductive age, what kind of exposure is it okay for them to be exposed to, when you're also considering the risk of childhood cancer in the children. So that's, yeah. So just to contrast between these two effects quickly and summarize what we just discussed. So deterministic effects appear above a given threshold, whereas there's no threshold for stochastic effects. The severity of a deterministic effect increases with the dose, whereas the probability of incidence increases with dose for stochastic effects. Effects occur within days for deterministic effects, and effects can have a latency period of decades for stochastic effects. And deterministic effects include tissue effects such as erythema, and stochastic effects include cancer and genetic mutations.